It's amazing how some books, even ones written centuries ago, can still resonate with us today.
Yeah, like they still speak to something fundamental about the human experience.
Exactly. And in the world of military strategy, few books have had the lasting impact of On War.
Ah, Clausewitz, a classic, right?
Absolutely. This book, written by Prussian military theorist Carl von Clausewitz back in the 19th century, is still studied in military academies all over the world.
Which probably tells you something right there. If it's still relevant after all this time, there must be some serious insights in those pages.
For sure. And that's what we're diving into today with this deep dive. On War. And specifically, we're tackling Chapter 1.
Laying the groundwork, setting the stage.
Exactly. And Clausewitz doesn't beat around the bush.
Yeah.
He jumps right in with a bold comparison, likening war to, of all things, a duel.
A duel, interesting. So two sides facing off, but on a much grander scale, I'm guessing.
Exactly. Now, I know what you might be thinking. A duel? Isn't that a bit of a simplification?
Well, warfare is anything but simple. So, yeah, I can see where you're going with that.
Right. But as much as it might seem like a simplification on the surface, it's actually a brilliant analogy when you think about it.
How so?
Well, at its core, a duel is about a clash of wills, right? Two individuals, each driven by their own motivations, facing off against each other.
And I'm guessing Clausewitz sees something similar playing out on a larger scale in warfare.
You got it. Except instead of two individuals, it's two nations, each with their own political objectives, their own desires, their own fears.
So it's that clash of opposing wills, that struggle for dominance, that really defines war, according to Clausewitz.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how this idea still holds true, even with all the ways warfare has evolved. I mean, think about it. Drones, cyber warfare, weapons of mass destruction. The sheer scale of destruction we're capable of today is mind-boggling.
No doubt. Technology has changed the game in countless ways. It's not your grandfather's battlefield anymore, that's for sure.
Right. But even with all that, even with all the technological advancements, at its core, war still boils down to that fundamental struggle Clausewitz identified.
The human element, the clash of wills, that's what makes it so compelling, so terrifying, and ultimately so difficult to truly master.
It's like Clausewitz is peeling back all those layers, the technology, the tactics, the logistics, to reveal that enduring truth about the nature of war. It's about one side imposing its will on another.
Powerful stuff. So if we're talking about war as this duel of wills, what's the objective? What's the end goal, according to Clausewitz?
Well, he argues that the theoretical goal of any war is to disarm the enemy.
Disarm. Okay, so we're not just talking about taking away their weapons.
Not necessarily, and this is where it gets interesting. Clausewitz, he's a smart guy. He recognizes that disarming doesn't always mean literally stripping a nation of every last rifle and cannon.
So it's a broader concept. There's more to it than meets the eye.
Exactly. It's about removing their capacity to resist your will.
Okay, so break down what that means. Give me some examples.
Sure. I mean, it could involve destroying their military forces, that's for sure. But it could also mean crippling their economy, shattering their morale to the point where they're no longer willing to fight, or even dismantling their political system.
Basically, whatever it takes to break their will to oppose you.
Exactly. Whether that's through brute force or more strategic means.
Which is interesting because when you look at modern warfare, we see that playing out all the time. You don't necessarily need to send tanks and troops to cripple an enemy.
Exactly. Think about cyber warfare, for instance. You can disrupt their infrastructure, mess with their communication networks, essentially paralyze their ability to function, let alone wage war.
And you can do all that without a single shot being fired in the traditional sense.
It's a perfect example of how Clausewitz's ideas still resonate in the 21st century. He was really ahead of his time.
He was dealing with cannons and muskets, and yet here we are talking about cyber warfare and information warfare, and his ideas still apply.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And kind of sobering when you think about it. The idea that even with all our technological prowess, victory often involves finding ways to break the enemy's will, to resist, to essentially force them to bend to our desires.
It's a sobering thought, no doubt, and one that Clausewitz doesn't shy away from. In fact, he goes even further, challenging those who believe that war can be some kind of bloodless affair.
He doesn't mince words, does he?
Not at all. He calls them philanthropists, and let's just say he's not using that term as a compliment.
He's got a way with words, that's for sure. But yeah, Clausewitz was definitely a realist, shaped by his experiences on the battlefield.
Exactly. And he saw firsthand how this kind of naive thinking believing that you can somehow sanitize war, make it this humane endeavor, it's not just misguided, it's actually dangerous.
Dangerous. How so?
Because it leads to poor decisions.
Yeah.
If you're not willing to acknowledge the inherent brutality of war, the fact that lives will be lost, sacrifices will have to be made, then you're not going to wage war effectively. It's that simple.
You're not going to achieve your objectives.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key point that Clausewitz makes, this idea of reciprocal action.
Okay, reciprocal action. Break that down for me.
Basically, it means that in war, everything is connected. Every action, every decision has a ripple effect. It's not enough to just plan your own moves. You have to be constantly thinking about how the enemy will respond.
So it's like a chess match. You make a move, and then you have to anticipate what your opponent's next move will be.
Exactly, except the stakes are infinitely higher. And the variables are much more complex. We're talking about human lives, national destinies.
So how do you even begin to wrap your head around that? I mean, how do you plan for all those possibilities?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? Clausewitz doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does stress the importance of understanding the enemy's motivations, their capabilities, their likely courses of action.
So it's not just about knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, but also those of your enemy.
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting. Clausewitz argues that this reciprocal action, this constant interplay between opposing forces, it's not just limited to the battlefield.
What do you mean? There are other factors at play.
Oh, absolutely. He was way ahead of his time in recognizing that war is not fought in a vacuum. It's influenced by a whole host of external factors.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, he talks about the critical role of geography, for one thing. Mountains, rivers, forests, these can all have a huge impact on how a battle unfolds.
Sure. Makes sense. That's basic terrain analysis, right?
Right. But he goes beyond that. He also emphasizes the importance of the population, the will of the people, the availability of resources, the support of allies, and even something as intangible as national morale.
Okay, so it's not just about having the bigger army or the better weapons. There are all these other factors that can tip the scales one way or the other.
Exactly. And for a military leader, understanding the interplay of all these factors, the military, the political, the social, the economic, it's absolutely crucial.
You've got to be able to see the bigger picture.
Precisely. You can't just focus on winning battles. You have to think about how those battles fit into the larger political objective. And that, I think, is one of Clausewitz's most enduring insights.
The political objective. So he's saying that war is never just about military victory. It's always about achieving some kind of political goal.
Exactly. Clausewitz reminds us that war, for all its complexities and unpredictable turns, is ultimately a tool. It should always, at least in theory, serve a political purpose.
Okay, that makes sense. But I imagine it's rarely that simple in practice, is it?
Of course not. Wars are messy, chaotic affairs. They don't always follow neat, predictable paths.
So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah.
How do you maintain that focus on the political objective when the situation on the ground is constantly changing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Clausewitz acknowledges that the political objective itself isn't static. It can evolve over time, influenced by the ebb and flow of the conflict.
So you're constantly having to reevaluate, adapt.
Exactly. And that requires flexibility, a willingness to adjust your strategy as the situation demands. It also requires a deep understanding of the relationship between political goals and military realities.
Because those two things aren't always aligned.
Absolutely. And that's why communication between military leaders and political leaders is so crucial. There has to be a shared understanding of what's possible, what's desirable, and what's ultimately at stake.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where military strategy and political objectives intersect.
Right. And that leads us to another key insight from Clausewitz, the importance of understanding why wars have pauses.
Pauses. So we're not just talking about ceasefires or peace negotiations here.
Not necessarily. Clausewitz is talking about those periods of relative inactivity that often occur during a conflict, even when there's no formal agreement to stop fighting.
Okay, so like lulls in the fighting. But why do they happen?
Well, he argues that these breaks in the fighting aren't just about catching your breath or regrouping. They're often dictated by the inherent advantages and disadvantages of offense and defense.
Interesting. So the tempo of war is constantly shifting, and sometimes it makes more sense to hold back than to push forward.
Exactly. Clausewitz makes a compelling argument that, in many cases, the defensive posture is inherently stronger, at least for a certain period.
So sometimes it's strategically advantageous to let the enemy come to you?
Exactly. He suggests that the defender often has an advantage simply because they can force the attacker to expend more resources and manpower to achieve their objectives.
So it's about choosing your battles carefully, knowing when to attack and when to hold back, when to exploit the advantages of defense.
Absolutely. He's not saying that offense isn't important, but he's emphasizing the need for strategic thinking and understanding when to leverage the inherent advantages of a well-prepared defense.
It makes you realize how much strategic thinking is involved in knowing when and where to apply force for maximum impact.
Absolutely. And it ties into another crucial aspect of Clausewitz's thinking. The whole idea that war is inherently unpredictable. You can never fully eliminate what he calls the fog of war.
The fog of war. It's a term we hear a lot, but what did Clausewitz actually mean by that?
He was talking about that inherent uncertainty that hangs over every battlefield. The idea that you can never have perfect information, no matter how much you plan, how much intelligence you gather.
And that's something that's probably resonated with military leaders throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. The enemy's intentions are often hidden. The terrain might not be what you expect. Your own troops might make mistakes. There are just so many variables at play, and they can change in an instant.
So even with all the advancements in technology since Clausewitz's time, satellite imagery, real-time communication, you name it, that fog of war is still a factor.
Absolutely. In fact, you could argue that technology has, in some ways, made the fog of war even more complex.
How so?
Well, think about the speed of modern warfare. The sheer volume of information that commanders have to process in real time. It can be overwhelming. And in that kind of environment, making the right decisions, it's more challenging than ever.
So it's not just about having the best technology. It's about being able to make sense of the information it gives you. And sometimes that information is going to be incomplete or even misleading.
Exactly. And that's where things like experience, intuition, and even a little bit of luck come into play. Clausewitz, he understood that war is not a purely rational endeavor.
There's a human element to it, an emotional component that you can't ignore.
Exactly. And that's why he emphasizes the crucial role of things like courage, decisiveness, the ability to think on your feet and adapt to changing circumstances. Those qualities, they can make all the difference when the fog of war descends. He even compares war to a game of cards.
A game of cards. Now that's an interesting analogy.
It is, isn't it? But it makes sense when you think about it. Because in war, just like in cards, you can plan all you want, but ultimately you're always at the mercy of the hand you're dealt. And sometimes you just have to know when to hold 'em and when to fold 'em.
And when to bluff.
Exactly. But in all seriousness, what Clausewitz is getting at here is that while strategy and preparation are essential in warfare, there's always an element of chance, an unpredictable human element that you can never fully account for.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That even with all our best efforts, victory is never guaranteed.
It is. But it's also a reminder that war, at its heart, is a human endeavor. It's driven by human choices, human emotions, and ultimately human fallibility.
And that's why I think On War continues to resonate with us today. Because even though it was written in a different time, in a different context, it speaks to something fundamental about the nature of conflict itself.
Absolutely. Clausewitz, he wasn't trying to write a rule book for winning wars. He was trying to understand war as a phenomenon in all its complexity and messiness. And in doing so, he created a work that's both timeless and incredibly relevant to the challenges we face today.
It's a powerful reminder that the study of history, of military theory, it's not just about memorizing dates and battles. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our world, the choices we make, and the consequences of those choices.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive for today.
But for all of you listening out there, keep Clausewitz's ideas in mind as you continue to study, to learn, and to lead.
Because the more we understand the nature of conflict, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the challenges of our own time.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into On War. We'll see you next time.
Until then, take care.